We are back, and this is Green Mountain Mornings on 100.3 FM, AM 1499 minutes past the top of the hour. I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'd like to welcome to the show via telephone Melanie Winters from the Reformer. How are you, Melanie?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
You're all warm and tucked in home? Nice warm home?
Yes, I am. I didn't want to risk that treacherous Route 9 drive, so...
As I told listeners earlier, having driven that road many times myself, I consider, let's see, what's the phrase? Discretion is the better part of valor when it comes to driving Route 9.
Well, especially since I don't have my snow tires on yet, and my mechanic is booked 2 weeks out. So.
Ooh. Yeah, I hope you brought your milk and bread because you might be there for a while.
Yeah, gotta have that French toast.
Oh, good. I'm glad you have French toast. Hey, did your kids have school today?
Yes, they did.
Okay, good. Good for them. Melanie, tell us, there was a piece in the Reformer, a fairly short piece, but it was about SIT and a faculty member who was there over the summer who was carrying TB.
Yes, tuberculosis. We were kind of shocked to see that. It's not something you hear about on a regular basis because it's not really found in this country,
right?
Because of vaccinations and so forth. But yeah, every once in a while, somebody from another country will come in, and in this case, the person was asymptomatic, so they weren't showing the signs of the illness when they were here. I guess it didn't surface until later. This happened. This person was visiting between August 5th and August 12th, and I guess there was just some precautionary testing done of students who might have been in the vicinity of this person, and testing is available to all the staff members on campus. And they've reported the SIT has reported this to the Department of Health. And so they're looking into it, and I guess the Department of Health has told them that the risk is extremely low that anyone else was exposed.
Yeah, that was something that was interesting because the article in the Reformer does quote the Vermont Department of Health, and it talked about how, we think of TB as something that's so contagious because there was a point in the world with sanitary conditions and that type of thing that it was more contagious.
Right.
But now that given sanitary conditions, given the way the is it a virus or a bacteria? I never remember.
I believe it's a bacteria
okay.
because they talk about this strain is not resistant to antibiotics.
There you go.
It's got to be some type of bacteria.
Right. That is actually really hard to catch person to person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it was thanks for your coverage because that is we sometimes forget, we get a little cavalier about making sure we're checking in with our doctor as we should and making sure we get everything checked that we should.
Right, and since there's a lot more international travel than there was just a few decades ago, the risk of being exposed to diseases and illnesses that have virtually been eradicated in this country, but not necessarily in other countries. Somebody comes to visit and they're carrying this virus or a virus or a bacteria or whatever, and they're not aware at the moment that they're infected, and that's when it's the most dangerous.
And let's shifting gears slightly. There was an AP story in the Reformer this morning that just caught my attention because hunting season has just opened.
Yep.
In Vermont, but one thing that a lot of states are dealing with nationwide right now is an overpopulation of deer, particularly in more populated areas.
Yes. We don't seem to have that problem here in southern Vermont. But yeah, up in like the Burlington area, Champlain Valley, I guess that's the worst part in the state. It's become overpopulated. Obviously, it's the mild winters have an effect on it, but also humans encroaching on deer habitat and so forth. So they're losing habitat, and there's climate change and all that. So yeah, the population has exploded to, I think the last count was 155,000.
Wow.
Which is the highest it's been in a couple of decades.
Mm-hmm.
And, they blame the mild winters, the fewer hunters, and fewer areas to hunt. So I guess what they're talking about doing is expanding archery season.
Oh, okay.
Because, some people, it's funny because, the AP pointed out some people like the deer and actually feed them and draw them into their property, but their next-door neighbor could be furious because the deer is also eating their shrubs and their plants and their flowers and all that kind of stuff. So,
right.
You kind of have to be a little courteous of your neighbors there, and the golden rule is don't feed wildlife anyway.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, and I wish I had looked this up before we got on air, so I apologize for that. I don't know if you know the answer, but I thought Vermont actually had some rules or laws around feeding wildlife.
There are laws against baiting. In
okay.
terms of baiting them in so you can hunt them.
Right.
But I don't know if there are any laws against just feeding them just so that you can draw them in to watch them.
Right.
Yeah, that's two different things, because the baiting issue, that's a question, that's a matter of ethical hunting and fair hunting and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with, spotlighting the deers, taking a bright light and deer in the headlights kind of thing, and they freeze, and, they have no defense, they're frozen, so they're not running away, so it's an unfair advantage to the hunter.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing with baiting.
But I agree, the good rule of thumb is not to feed wildlife.
Yeah.
Well, Melanie and I are going to hand you on over to Pat Pagano and his weather forecast. We shall return after the break, and we'll be talking about more local news like education funding. How's that, Melanie?
Oh, yeah.
We are back, and this is Green Mountain Mornings on 100.3 FM, AM 1490. I am your host, Olga Peters, 23 minutes past the top of the hour, and welcome Melanie Winters from the Reformer. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
I am really curious about your point of view on this next news item, because you live in the town, or you live near the town, that this is actually happening in, and that has to do with a lawsuit filed by some residents and the town of Whitingham against the state over its education funding formula, which we usually call Act 60 or Act 68. That lawsuit has recently jumped a hurdle. Could you explain that?
Yes. Well, just for some background, I believe it was last town meeting, the town voted to set aside $100,000 to pursue legal action against the state regarding education funding. And this most recent hurdle, I guess the state had petitioned the court for a summary judgment to basically get the case dropped. And the court ruled in the town's favor, saying that there was cause to move forward. I think the court agreed with the plaintiffs in saying the town has the capacity to sue the state in order to protect its taxpayers and students from unconstitutional action and itself from potential legal exposure. Now, the town is suing the state because alleging that the education funding is unconstitutional, and that it puts Whitingham, and I do live in Whitingham, it puts the Whitingham students at a disadvantage, and the taxpayers end up paying more while the school is getting less. For example, just because of the way that the funding formula is drawn out, Whitingham, because of its student population, ends up paying more in taxes, but it doesn't get as much. Like, for example, you look at the Brattleboro School, the Brattleboro High School, and they have, 4 or 5 foreign language programs and just all kinds of academic and extracurricular programs that they can afford that Whitingham cannot, just because of the way the funding formula is set up. And, Whitingham and Wilmington went through this whole process of consolidation before Act 46 even came about. We consolidated our schools. We closed a school, all in the name of trying to save money and trying to stem the tide of lower student enrollment.
Well, and also make sure that students could have foreign language and all those curriculum
and beef up the academic offerings. That didn't happen. And in fact, was it last year, both Whitingham and Wilmington got hit with huge tax increases because of the per pupil spending issue, the equalized per. I don't know the specifics of how the formula is drawn out, but I do know that it has to do with per pupil spending, like equalized per pupil spending, so that they can factor in like special education and so forth, and also the tax, like the grand list kind of thing, and a combination of those two factors. And Whitingham just seems to keep getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah, and it pretty much has since Act 60 and Act 68 came into being, and I think it's because Whitingham is one of those outlier towns where on paper it looks quite wealthy, given the amount of land and given the power company nearby.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't. When you look at the household income, it's a very different set of numbers, in my opinion.
Yeah, and there is not a whole lot of business or industry, so the tax burden falls on the homeowners predominantly.
Well, and we should remind people that Act 60 sort of has two forks to it, and its main impetus or its main intention is to make sure that all students have equal opportunities, regardless of how wealthy or poor their town is.
Right.
And so that's the main intention. And then there's the funding structure that actually makes sure that this intention comes to be. And so I think that makes it really hard sometimes to talk about Act 60 because people are like, no, you don't want kids to have equal opportunity. And that's not always necessarily the case. The case is this funding structure actually treating towns fairly, which I think is kind of Whitingham's big question.
Right. The bigger towns, the bigger schools, they have more economy of scale. Mm-hmm. And so that they can offer more programs for the same amount of spending that Whitingham offers, less programs.
Right. And Whitingham and Wilmington, and we should probably use them as two since they are under the district
the Twin
of Twin Valley.
Yes.
They aren't necessarily small enough either to qualify for some of the small school grants.
Correct.
So they're falling in this funny little gray area that you're right is costing the school a lot.
I mean, not to disparage the school. It's a wonderful school. Mm-hmm. My kids are thriving. They're at the middle school now, and they are absolutely thriving. They love their teachers. The teachers do a great job, but there's only so much they can do. With limited funding.
Yeah, it's a question of resources.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
And I found it really interesting in the Reformer article how I think Chris Mays wrote it that the state had argued, the town can't be a part of this lawsuit because it's education, and education is a different world than municipal world. And I found it really interesting that the court was like, yeah, no.
Because, the town suffers from, its tax base suffers.
Mm-hmm.
And the lawsuit was actually filed by a student and a taxpayer.
Right. And then the town kind of came on.
Yeah, the town is handling the legalities of it, but the lawsuit itself was filed by a student and a taxpayer. Mm-hmm. The town is kind of like a interested third party kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And helping these folks navigate it. Well, I'm really interested to see how the next phase goes, because if this lawsuit it ends up being in favor of the student, the taxpayer, the town, it might change education funding in Vermont.
I think it would have to. I mean, the court would force it. I mean, that's how the original funding.
Yeah, that's how Act 60 came to be, actually.
About.
Yeah. Yeah, and how the court balances the original intention of Act 60 against this funding structure will be interesting.
Yeah.
This is Green Mountain Mornings. You are listening on 100.3 FM, AM 1490. I am your host, Olga Peters. It is 37 minutes past the top of the hour. And Melanie Winters from the Reformer. Tell us about the bear at Green Street School.
Yeah, that was quite a popular story. I mean, we got so many hits on Facebook for that story. It's kind of a cute story. The kids at Greenfield School, they were going out for recess. I believe this was Friday.
It was
Going
this
out
Greenfield
for
or Green
recess,
Street?
and somebody saw a bear at the back of the playground. And so they hurried the kids back inside the school, and they called the Fish and Wildlife, the game warden.
Mm-hmm.
And the game warden came, and I guess the bear, there's a lot of speculation on Facebook that the bear got into too many apples and was kind of loopy. Because the game warden said the bear was like really lethargic and just kind of climbed up in a tree and went to sleep.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it found something in a dumpster.
So they kept the kids inside just as a precaution. And I guess they have this is not the first time wildlife has wandered into the schoolyard. So I guess they have a whole system. What was it say? We have a plan in place for this type of situation, is the principal. Get out of the playground, get back into school, and make an announcement. And so that's what they did. And the game warden, there was really nothing the game warden could do, because Kelly Price was the game warden. Mm-hmm. Because he didn't want to spook the bear. He didn't want to agitate it or make it angry, because then that would just escalate the situation, make it worse.
Okay.
So they kind of just left it alone.
Not a bad rule of thumb when it comes to wildlife, especially really big wildlife.
They kept the kids inside during recess, and then when it came to the end of school, they made sure that the kids, whoever needed to get on the bus got on the bus, and the walkers were actually escorted home. Because you know how kids get curious. Some of them might want to double back and get a peek at the bear. So they actually had staff members walk the kids home to make sure that they got home safe and sound. And but it was actually kind of cute. And our Facebook page, I think the story got something like 12,000 views.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, our design desk person, our paginator, she also handles the social media posts, and she was all like, Bob's bear story broke Facebook and all this kind of stuff. It was actually kind of funny. But yeah, 12,000 views and like hundreds of shares and likes, and I mean, people just really responded. They thought it was adorable.
And remind me, which school was this again?
Green Street School.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, it is rare that you see a bear in such a populated area. I mean, I've certainly seen them on the Brattleboro's more back roads.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, downtown Green Street School is downtown.
Oh yeah, that's a suburban area right there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad Bob can put on his resume that he has a story that broke the internet.
Yeah.
That is quite an achievement. And you guys did have a great photo as well.
Oh yeah. He looks quite comfy up there in the tree.
Mm-hmm. He's just snoozing, letting the world go by.
Yep. Like a lot of people are speculating he must have gotten to some fermented apples and got kind of loopy.
They do that.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I remember, so my family used to have a wild blueberry farm. And bears, of course, love wild blueberries. But every now and then they'd get into an old pile.
Yep.
And yeah.
It's fermenting, yeah.
They didn't walk straight. Let's head south a little bit to Vernon and talk about one of the major changes the select board is considering, and of course town meeting would have to approve it, but that would be changing the position of treasurer and town clerk from elected positions to appointed positions.
Yes, and the reasoning for this is that there's concern, and this is not reflective. The select board has made clear this is not reflective of the current people holding those positions. Mm-hmm. But there have been cases around the state, even fairly recently, of elected people in town clerk or treasurer positions that are handling money and kind of handling it inappropriately. Mm-hmm. And whether it's just a matter of not having the experience or the competence to do that kind of job, or whether it's outright fraud. Mm-hmm. There have been cases of that as well. And then the feeling is that instead of electing somebody who, in some cases might be more of a popularity contest than a who's the best person for this job kind of thing, And so the select board is concerned that they want the best qualified, and they feel that by going through the hiring process and the screening process and so forth, that they can get a better qualified candidate as opposed to somebody who is appealing to the electorate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the current treasurer and town clerk are worried about losing their job,
Right.
and so there was some pushback on it, and the meeting actually got a little testy where they started veering off topic and kind of nitpicking over previous grievances or whatever. But the select board basically wants to put it on the town meeting agenda and put it up for the vote. That's what the last select board meeting was about. That discussion, but there was some concern. Even those who are receptive to the idea of discussing the issue, there was concern about leaving it up to town meeting for a vote because of low turnout, and they're asking to perhaps make it an Australian ballot instead, so that more people can vote on it. Mm-hmm. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out.
Well, I have to say, this issue in general is I'm finding really interesting and something that I hope Vernon residents really give a lot of thought, because while I hear the select board's concerns, if we'll remember our colleague or peer Wendy Levy over at the Commons did extensive coverage of what happened in Putney when was it their town clerk was elected and then stopped coming to work.
Right, yes.
And that caused the town a lot of problems. At the same time, to me, this issue highlights the issue around engagement. That while I hear the select board's concern about popularity contests or versus finding the right person for the job, if we are engaged, in an ideal world, you would have multiple people running for the position with the electorate asking them a lot of hard questions. And you would vet them through that process. I don't know if maybe we have reached a point as a society, and this is something Vernon has to ask itself, do we still have that engagement for that kind of volunteer/elected municipality? Or do we need to professionalize, i.e. create a hiring process?
Yeah, I don't know. For positions like treasurer and town clerk, I don't know that there ever was a vetting process through the election because people, I mean, they're important positions, but when it comes to voting on the ballot, people don't pay a whole lot of attention to those two posts.
Right. Well, and that's why I said ideal.
I mean, we've talked about this before. Turnout at local elections is abysmally low. But when people do turn out, they're more likely to pay attention to the school board or the select board. And treasurer and town clerk and some of the lower offices kind of get forgotten about or don't get due consideration. So I don't know if they're ever really. I mean, maybe if you go back before my time, but I don't recall there ever being like really serious vetting in the election process for positions like treasurer and town clerk. I mean, it's very rare to find two people opposing. Well, that's the race.
Right, which I think is true for a lot of elections in Vermont, which I would argue is a bit of an issue and a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
So, I think Vernon has to, and our conversation right now just kind of highlights that. Vernon has some questions to ask itself as far as how it wants to engage and how it wants to operate its municipality.
Yeah. But, it's a conversation that, I think would, they get some value out of at least having the conversation, whichever way they decide to go.
Yeah.
At least make people aware that this is an issue.
I agree. Now, BMH, we've heard a lot of coverage about gaps in Vermont's mental health system, particularly gaps that lead to people sitting in emergency rooms or emergency departments for days at a time when they need a mental health program. And BMH is kind of addressing that issue by hiring a mental health specialist. Tell us about that, Melanie.
Yes. Right now, this all kind of goes back to a shift in mental health care in this country. There was a time back in the late 70s, early 80s, I believe it was Jimmy Carter, just before he left office, signed the Mental Health Systems Act. And this was to provide grants to community mental health centers. And there was a whole movement to get away from institutionalized mental health institutions because the care that the people were getting was appalling. Their civil rights were constantly violated. I mean, all types of appalling treatment. So there was that movement to kind of deinstitutionalize mental health system. And then Ronald Reagan came in and he repealed the Mental Health Systems Act, supposedly to kind of put resources back into the patient's hands. The patient decides for their own care. Mm-hmm. What ended up happening was a lot of severely mentally ill people were kind of thrust out into society and ended up being homeless. Mm-hmm. So the estimates now are about a third of our homeless population has severe mental illness.
Right.
So now the emphasis is going back to more community-based systems, not institutionalizing them necessarily, but providing, outpatient care and so forth. But that has led to a reduction in inpatient beds for the more severe cases. Mm-hmm. And these people, the more severe cases, they end up in an emergency room because there's no beds available for them. And, the emergency people and the police department are not trained or equipped to handle such severe cases. I mean, the police department, or the sheriff's department, they have to post a guard there whose only job, when he could be out working the community, he's got to stay there and guard this one person.
Right. And an emergency department is not an appropriate place for someone who's in crisis.
No. I mean, have you ever been to an emergency? It's chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
It's chaotic. It's bright and it's busy and it's not a calm atmosphere. So somebody who is in a mental health crisis is not going to be calm or is not going to calm down in that type of atmosphere.
Right.
So BMH is hiring a clinician who could begin treatment while the patient waits for an appropriate bed. So they're not just sitting in limbo and a constant state of crisis and panic mm-hmm. over their situation. So hopefully this will help resolve the issue of the severe cases ending up in emergency rooms and just. I mean, nobody's equipped to deal with it.
Right.
So hopefully this will address that issue.
Well, and it will hopefully address the issue, too, that when I talk to professionals in the mental health system, they often talk about when someone's ready for treatment specifically, but also if they need treatment, the quicker you can get them that treatment, the more, this is a crass term, but the more kind of bang for your buck.
Right.
The more return on your efforts and the faster that person can start coming out of crisis.
Yes.
And so that's the other problem with someone sitting in an emergency room. That crisis gets deeper.
Yeah. It escalates. And the atmosphere doesn't help.
No. Melanie Winters from the Reformer, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.
I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yes, 2 weeks.
Fantastic. Take care and stay off the icy roads.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.